Right, and welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2019, brought to you in partnership with our gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24 and hitting that subscribe button. You can follow us on ID24Conf on Twitter. And if you have any questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, and we'll ask them at the end of the session. A quick reminder that ID24 is a respectful community with a code of conduct available at the inclusivedesign24.org website. We would also like to say a quick hello to everybody joining us live from ID24TO in Toronto at Fable Tech Labs. And next up, we have Claudio Luis Vera and Ioana Talasli. And the presentation is, Carrie?
Accessibility in emerging countries.
Thank you. Right, take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Claudio Luis Vera, and some of you may know me. I work with a major cruise company, Royal Caribbean. And one of the advantages that I have of working here is that I get to work on one hand with digital accessibility, and on the other hand, I get to work with accessibility in the physical world. And also because we're a cruise company, we travel to many different countries. And that was part of, the reason why, we decided to have this talk about accessibility in emerging countries, because we run into different cultures, we run into different legal structures, different sorts of bureaucracies and stuff from one country to the next. And so a lot of those themes are what you're going to find here in this talk today. So I'm going to pass it along to Ioana and let her introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm Ioana Talasli. I come from Greece. I'm an accessibility advocate, and I would love to share my story about Greece and what happens here. And that's it.
So one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is we're going to kind of dive back into a little bit of Marxist theory, actually, from a few decades ago. And we're going to look at world systems theory, which kind of divides the world into different kinds of companies, countries, which is kind of like haves and have-nots. And this sort of thinking originated in Yale in the 70s. And a lot of it has to do with, what is core and what is periphery. So let's look at core nations. So core nations are what many of us would call the developed world. In the 19th century, you would have called them colonial powers. They are economically diversified, they're wealthy, they're powerful, but they also have very strong central governments, and they have very extensive bureaucracies, or in other words, big government. You also have stronger and more complex state institutions, and they're well funded because you have a very large tax base to support all of that sort of infrastructure. So your other countries might have like an informal economy where a lot of income is not being reported. In a core nation, almost everything is being reported and almost everything is being taxed or regulated economically in some way or another. Core nations also tend to be very technologically advanced. They're in the forefront. In terms of income distribution, it's much more even. So you don't tend to have like a very small aristocracy that owns 99% of the wealth. You have a larger aristocracy that owns maybe 80% of the wealth. But you also will find a strong working class. You'll find a strong middle class that's well educated and that votes. So in contrast, let's look then at peripheral nations. So we have photos here, for instance, from Peru, where some of my family is from. They're less economically diversified. So they have typically one cash crop or one sort of mineral export or tourism. One industry, which is really the core of the country's economy. You have weaker governments with weaker institutions, a smaller tax base to draw from. So you may have a department that handles with, like, for instance, human affairs, but that is less well-funded and less likely to be able to sponsor programs for people with disabilities. You also find less industrialization. You'll find a more uneven income distribution where a much smaller proportion of the population owns a much larger share of the resources, and you may not even find in some countries a strong middle class or one very much to speak of. So the other thing is, historically, peripheral nations have been very much influenced by core nations, or if not, they've been very much influenced by organizations like, say, like the IMF or the World Bank that lend money to peripheral nations and set the terms for those loans. And so oftentimes they're not necessarily the masters of their own destiny. So let's look at the US, which is, let's look at it at a nationwide level, and then let's also like maybe compare a few of the different cities. So in the US, you have very strong legislation. We're familiar with Section 508. We may be almost as familiar with the 21st Century Video Accessibility Act, or the CVAA. And we have public institutions for people with disabilities. We also have fairly strong statistics through the Census Bureau. So Census Bureau keeps a fairly good tally every 10 years with occasional surveys in between of what the amount of people are with disabilities and the levels of the sort of disabilities that they have. We also have accommodations for voters with disabilities. So if you're not sighted, you have other sort of affordances and ways to vote. That may not exist in other countries. So you may actually find a large population of people with disabilities not being able to have access to the ballot box, which becomes a key issue. And we also have, in the States, we have well-funded charities and philanthropies. So if we look at different metro areas, we have a list of these in the US and in Canada: Seattle, the DC area, the Bay Area, Chicago, New York, Boston, Toronto, Montreal. And I am proud to say that I am not in any of those right now. So what would you find, on the other hand, in a core metro area? Well, you're going to find a critical mass of accessibility practitioners. You're going to find dedicated accessibility consulting firms or organizations. You're going to have almost definitely a very well-established meetup group. And so definite shout outs to our fellow peeps in Toronto and in Chicago for doing such a great job. And they're going to have regular accessibility events. And those meetup groups and those organizations are pretty well sponsored. So those are, I would say, are the hallmark of a strong metro area that we could say is part of the accessibility core in the United States. In South Florida, well, we have our cafecito culture, as you can see by the photo. We don't have the critical mass of accessibility practitioners. As a matter of fact, I could probably count the full-time accessibility practitioners on this side of the Georgia line, probably on one hand. So that's to give you an idea of just, it's a small community. It's not about reaching out to practitioners. It's really about reaching out to people who are, say, UX designers, developers, entrepreneurs, who work in technology in one way or another, but who don't handle accessibility full time. So we don't have any dedicated accessibility organizations that are larger than 20 people that are based here in South Florida, which also leaves us with a very small sponsorship pool to pull from if we want to have an accessibility meetup group. So these are sort of initiatives that I've started over the last year or so. We have just this meetup group that's in its infancy. We're just starting to have regular events, and we use different language a lot of times than you would find in other parts of the country. So, there are certain terms in other parts of the country or in core cities would be found offensive, that I just find people using constantly, even within disability organizations. So let's take this a step further. So let's go beyond the core to, like, say, a state like Florida. Let's go to Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is interesting because it's technically still within the US, and it's where the core and the periphery collide. So how does this happen? Well, picture yourself in a public hospital in Puerto Rico. It has been built with US government funds. You'll find that all the signage, the mobility, the access, all really meets US government standards, which are pretty high. And then what you're going to find is that those standards end at the sidewalk. So you have this sort of juxtaposition between the American government and pretty much what you would find in the rest of Latin America, which is not as developed. And so you'll find, for instance, that government, anything that's related to the government is great. Statistics and data gathering are almost as good as they are on the mainland. Institutions are there. You'll also find that they're based on the medical and the charity models of disability. So employment opportunities may not be the best for somebody who's in Puerto Rico, certainly if you have a disability, but on the other hand, there is lots of government funding. So you're kind of, you know, the way it's structured, it almost pushes it into a sort of welfare state. So you're also going to find things in Latin culture that are very significantly different than in the States. People with disabilities, a lot of times, you don't even refer to them by name in Latin culture. So, you know, it's like if Maria has a deaf son, you would refer to them as El Sordo de Maria, you know, so you wouldn't even refer to him by his name, even if it was Gustavo or something, you know, in common conversation, they would lose their name. We in the States like to say that we are not our disabilities, but in Latin America, you are nicknamed, and that disability would basically become part of your name or how people talk about you for life. So, you know, all of us have an aunt that's La Gorda, or you have like famous entertainers like Marco Cabreras, Flaco Jimenez, where those words are basically addressing whether or not they're fully abled or other physical features like being skinny. So it's very hard culturally to separate disability from how you think of a person. The other thing I want to point out is that in Spanish, like as in all Romance languages, gender is at the core of every noun and every adjective you use. So gender neutrality in Latin culture is a much, much harder thing to achieve, if it can ever be achieved, than it would be in American culture. So people with disabilities, you know, typically they're also not independent. So that kind of brings you into this sort of protective society that you have. So when Hurricane Maria passed through the island 2 years ago, there was, you know, the collapse of the infrastructure led a lot of people to emigrate here to South Florida. And what happened a lot of times is those immigrants chose their situation, they chose their living, they chose where they went to based on the facilities that they needed for whatever household members had a disability. But it doesn't necessarily come from a place of empowerment. It comes from, you know, the sort of charity or medical model where you're looking at somebody who is disadvantaged with some sort of pity. The other thing with Puerto Rico right now is, you know, with the change of government and with all the sort of chaos that's been going on, there have been historically a lot of missed opportunities for improvement. But, you know, on the other hand, if Puerto Rico could get somehow on track to the same level as the United States and be able to capitalize on a lot of the opportunities that we have here stateside, you know, there is actually a lot of potential for growth and improvement. So for access, you know, what are things that we would want to see in a culture to be successful with access? Low social inequality, a strong middle class, political stability, a lot of social trust, an absence of corruption and cronyism, and the ability of a culture to evolve and change and become modern. So next up, we're going to pass it on to Ioana, and we're going to be talking about Greece with a different point of view and a different set of challenges. So we're kind of working our way from core outwards. So why don't you tell us what it's like in Greece? I mean, what is the culture there? Would you be able to be open, out in the open if you have a disability?
Depends. It isn't considered a private affair, especially when we refer to the so-called invisible disabilities. People will not talk easily about them. A factor which makes things more complicated is that private health insurance companies and sometimes state officials treat disability as a disease. So a reason for people to be open about their disability is mostly to get the proper medical treatment when they're facing problems in their everyday life. This is not the case, of course, for disability advocates having a visible disability. Those confront the legislation and fight for, by all means, for universal accessibility, meaning to the physical and the digital world. And according to a survey, people in 2013 were much more open discussing about their disability comparing to 2002.
So I know in some countries it's acceptable to discriminate openly against people with disabilities, or sometimes, there's a different way that people handle that. What's that like in Greece?
My personal opinion is it's not okay at all to discriminate anyone. In fact, it is a disgrace to discriminate or make fun or bully any human. But from a legal point of view, the European Union provides directive, so it's all members to comply against discrimination. So the Greek Parliament had to pass a law to in line with the European directives. That happened with the law 443/2016, which was an update of the legal framework of the prohibition of discrimination. The principle of equal treatment applies to all persons, regardless of their age, race, color, ethnicity, disability, or chronic disease. But according to that law, a presidential decree should have been enacted in a 12 months period after the law's publication in order to promote the application of the principle of non-discrimination beyond the employment and occupation, for example, in social security and healthcare. But this is not enacted yet, so there is a gap in the current legislation as it does not protect persons with disabilities in all areas of their life. And there was another research asking people with disabilities, what do they believe if there is discrimination, if they still face discrimination in Greece, and 79% believes there is still discrimination, and they feel that in the job market, at the street, and of course at the lack of access in public spaces. And 8 out of 10 believe that limited or non-existent access to goods and services, it is a discrimination towards persons with disabilities.
So what is, with the law that's there, I mean, what is the legal framework like? Because that's kind of like what you build everything else on top of.
Of course. Greece is a part of the UN, also part of the EU, the European Union, and since the Article 9 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities obliges member states and the EU to take appropriate measures to ensure access for persons with disabilities on equal basis with others, including information and communication technologies and the internet. Greece as a member state had to comply with the EU directive, and the law passed, which provides accessibility only to the public sector bodies, websites, and applications for mobile devices. And in that law passed in 2019 by the Greek Parliament, and it covers all these. I mean, the public sector bodies, but it has a number of exceptions, like the national television and radio stations. it needs the accessibility is measured up to the European standard EN 301549 to make websites and mobile apps accessible. The law states that it requires regular monitoring and reporting of the public sector websites and mobile apps by member states, and these reports have to be communicated to the Commission and to be made public. And for that reason, there was created a registry, which is called the Registry of Public Sector Websites and Applications. And in this record, all accessible websites and applications for mobile devices must be registered and appear online as soon as they comply with the accessibility requirements stated by the law. It also sets concrete dates with deadlines to comply with the European directive. And so far, I haven't seen anything online. I've checked just a few minutes ago before our session begins, and unfortunately, there was nothing there. That's pretty much about the accessibility, the web accessibility around. So I hope, and let's wait to see what happens, and I will keep you posted via Twitter if anything changes for the better.
Right, right. So, Ioana, I mean, do you see like that there's like this different level of compliance that's needed from a government website or a public sector website as opposed to a private site? Is there a difference like between e-commerce sites and just regular personal websites?
There's nothing on the private sector yet.
Nothing at all.
The law that I've mentioned before was it is strictly about the public sector bodies. It's only for the government. It's not and I don't think that it is inside the government. So there's nothing about an ordinary website making you comply with accessibility standard yet.
So even with tourism being a large sector of the Greek economy, for instance, I mean, a hotel website, a ferry company website, a restaurant website, if you were, say, a blind person, you wouldn't necessarily be able to book reservations on any of those, right?
If the company feels that there is an audience there, which for me, there's a huge audience there, of course they would do something about it. But there is no law making them do something about that.
Right. Interesting.
So far, I guess. I hope, not I guess, I hope so far. In the future, I hope we see a change in that.
So I know we could talk about the different organizations that can handle it. You know, do you want to maybe talk about, you know, which organizations are the strongest maybe in Greece?
There's the National Confederation of Disabled People of Greece. Then there's the Greek Ombudsman. There are various organizations depending on the disability under the umbrella of the National Organization of People with Disabilities in Greece, and various NGOs promoting disability awareness, assertion of rights, and services for persons with disabilities.
So what about the state of the art of like statistics or the, you know, the sort of knowledge that you can gather?
The collection of statistical data regarding disability is very poor and strictly limited to the health field, to the field of health research. So unfortunately, there is not any accurate public record gathering data from the competent ministries. As a country, we don't have any demographics regarding age, gender, types of disabilities, etc. So this is a thing that makes even harder the work of us advocates.
Right. So yeah, like the Census Bureau in the United States will ask you questions about the level of assistance that you need. Can you read without difficulty? Can you dress yourself? I imagine those sorts of statistics don't exist.
No.
Okay. So it's hard to get anything about accommodations because really you're dealing with disability as a medical condition.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So I know a few years ago, I mean, you guys went through a really painful time there, with the financial crisis and with the debt crisis and the austerity that was imposed on you, through the IMF. How did it affect people with disabilities there?
First, it affected the whole country. As you said, it is a really sad topic for middle and low class citizens, which suddenly had to deal with such a severe wave of distraction in our everyday lives and well-being. For the last years, suicides in Greece have drawn national and international interest due to the economic crisis, which began from the United States and spread all around Europe in 2008. That period occurred at the same time of fiscal austerity, as you said, and increase of unemployment rates and negative economic growth. On average, I'm going to give some numbers on that so you will understand better the situation. Salary cuts were by 40%, pension reductions by 50%, 60% homeless in their 30s to 40s, public spending reductions by 70 billion euros. So people were searching dumpsters for food. It felt like a war zone. So in Greece, according to published reports, official public reports, suicide mortality rates have been on a remarkable upward trend up to 40%, and they were most related to unemployment. So according to the official records gathered by the Hellenic Statistic Authority, more than 4,200 people committed suicide in Greece due to the economic crisis. So it was a really huge issue. That part was many people lost their lives due to that. And another very big issue was it's the phenomenon called the brain drain, where around 427,000 Greeks in their 30s to 40s have emigrated, mostly, but not only, to the other EU countries from 2008 to 2016. So more than 2/3 were university graduates, health professionals, engineers, IT graduates whose field of study is in demand in destination countries and all these form a big segment of the migrant population. Also, there were at the time financial scandals, environmental crimes to the future generations, and it was an awful era in all aspects. We felt the terror of what the next semester will bring. So at the same time, the demolition of any social structure and a war on democracy, nationalists became the third most powerful political party in our parliament. And another thing was that a war on Syria forced thousands of refugees every month to leave their country. And that was a huge humanitarian issue. And all of those arrived through our sea borders in Greece. And that was really tough for them and still is. And so as for the second part of your question about affecting the disabled people, we don't have any updated specific data on the matter, but according to the National Confederation of Disabled People, interviewing 4,000 people in 2013, the main findings that I extracted just for this talk is on the question, which are the factors of your life deterioration. 74% said that the main factor is the shrinking income from compensations and pensions. 59% said that the second factor is the lack of access in the job market. And in the second question regarding barriers in decent and independent living, 88% said the inefficiency of public sector structures, and 73% the social prejudice, and 58% their disability. So as you say, everything when we talk about disability is much worse than thinking the ordinary population, not
Right.
the average, not the ordinary, sorry.
So, and you know, I mean, I can imagine, I mean, you being of that age group, you know, where there was the brain drain and, you know, a high level of homelessness. I mean, it must have had a pretty big impact on you personally.
Sure, sure. It was the most horrible era, as I recall it. I've been an artist and a business owner for more than 17 years, starting from the bottom up, hardworking to a demanding environment, setting goals for me and my business, gaining recognition, financial freedom was my reality until that time. I was living and doing business in the Greek islands of the Aegean Sea. You all know those, dealing with foreign tourists mostly. So things were never as bad for me as they were for people living in Athens and other large cities at the time. Of course, I'm privileged to have a very supporting family, which stood by me when things seemed that they were never going to be normal ever again. So I realized really early that I had to be resourceful in order to survive this ugly storm of sadness all around me. And becoming a digital nomad has always been appealing to me. Wanting to taste the border-free digital world that the huge rise of internet could provide me, working remotely for companies all over the world. So full stack web development was the ship in that new journey, but not the destination. With web accessibility and more specifically creating accessible users experiences spoke from the beginning into the soul of a human who detests discrimination, marginalization, and loves to create memorable experiences for all to enjoy in the best way possible, which has always been my compass in my professional life. So that's it. This is pretty much how I ended up with in accessibility. So I'm not sure where I will find the proper soil to blossom. I can only fit in a team that celebrates accessibility, diversity, and inclusion, and where accessibility is a default state before the beginning of any project, playing a huge role in all stages, and not, of course, an afterthought due to limited time or budget. And that's hard in Greece, according, about the time and the budget. So I'm always in the hunt of exploring all those new things about human conditions and the limitations the surrounding environment will bring inevitably to all of us at some point in our life. At the same time, since while I'm studying, I'm a part-time caretaker to one of my most loved people in the world, diagnosed with dementia. So the cognitive part of disability and the aging population with the combined limitations that this state brings to people is the one that I relate most at this point of my life, and I would like to explore further in my future job positioning.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I hear from what you're saying a lot of the same common struggles, you know, and the same sort of, you know, having an older parent that's kind of like introducing you into a lot of the issues around aging and disabilities that come with aging.
Yeah.
So maybe taking an eye and looking a little bit at the future. I mean, is there a path? Or, I mean, is there a roadmap that you see that Greece may be taking towards accessibility?
In general, I believe that as a country, we need to take the following actions if we want to see a change happening. I mean, develop a regulation that defines the methodology of disability mainstreaming to all public policies, adapt a concrete quantitative and qualitative indicators for the evaluation and measurement of the disability mainstreaming to them, take concrete legislative measures to recognize that the denial of reasonable accommodation constitutes direct discrimination on disability grounds. Specialize, of course, the terms disability not in the medical, like a medical condition, rather than following the social model of accessibility, which I follow. Specialize also the terms reasonable accommodation and disproportionate burden, and to implement measures to provide reasonable accommodation without treating accessibility and people with disabilities as a burden in the end. In the Greek state ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2012. And while the inlining with the specific details on the implementation and the monitoring of the convention were introduced in 2017 with a national law adapting the human rights approach and the social model of disability, there is no universally applied definition on disability, and thus the medical approach to disability prevails in many areas. For example, in the field of disability assessment, which is hard.
Right, right. So I don't know, maybe looking a little bit further, what's the impact that the legislation is going to have, or what's happening, in the near future?
I hope it will be positive. Universal accessibility, meaning both the physical and the digital world, is the goal for the future. Delays in adoption with EU directives raise financial penalties. We could use those fines instead to educate public servants in order to provide quality services, eliminating barriers and prejudice and discrimination towards people with disabilities. There is the European Accessibility Act, which passed from the EU Parliament on the 13th of March 2019. And it is a directive that aims to improve the functioning of the internal market and for accessible products and services by removing barriers in the EU member states. And all EU member states will have to integrate the directive into their national legislation in 3 years after it is published in the EU's official journal. This will ensure that national market surveillance authorities have to compensate to hold private entities accountable. The European Accessibility Act also fulfilled two important demands from the disability movement. First, it is the electronic communications and the 112 emergency number. And all those will become accessible to everyone throughout the European Union. And the requirements of the Act will also support the rules for accessible products and services. So public authorities do not anymore use taxpayers' money in products and services and facilities that are discriminatory of persons with disabilities. So those are two huge wins for the disability community. And of course, there are a number of benefits from the European Accessibility Act, both for businesses in the EU and the European citizens. The businesses will benefit from common rules on accessibility in the EU, leading to cost reduction, easier cross-border trading. More market opportunities for accessible products and services, and persons with disabilities, and especially the elders, will benefit from more accessible products and services in the market in far more competitive prices, fewer barriers when accessing transport, education, and the open labor market, and more jobs available where accessibility expertise is needed. So the European Act covers products and services that have been identified as being most important for persons with disabilities. And those products and services include pretty much computers and operating systems, ATMs, ticketing and check-in machines, smartphones, TV equipment, telephony services, banking services, e-books, e-commerce. But on the other hand, despite all those, the European Disability Forum, which is an umbrella organization for the European organizations for persons with disability, stated in their press release that this is their actual, this is an actual part from their press release. However, the Act still does not satisfy our key demands. It is misleading to say that the Act will ensure full accessibility of buildings and means of transport, where at the heart of which were this means that millions of persons living in the EU will still face daily struggles to leave their home. The Act does not include household appliances such as washing machines and microwaves, for etc. And this means that millions of persons with disabilities will still face daily difficulties to use appliances and live in their own home.
Right. I'm not so sure that isn't something that's unique to Greece too, because I mean, you see, like for instance, a lot of the countries where the appliances are made, don't have any significant advantage. So if you have issues with appliances, Greece, you would have them in South Korea or Japan or the United States as well. So I mean, we definitely do have a struggle in front of us in all of those regards. So
another thing is that micro enterprises providing services were exempted from complying with the requirements of the Act, and this exception will significantly reduce the Act's impact.
So if you have a smaller business, then you're not bound to the effects or the
Nope.
in that Act.
No.
Yeah, so that could make things interesting. So I don't know. I mean, from this conversation that we've had, looking at Greece, looking at different aspects of the United States, I was hoping to be able to have something a little bit broader, but it's hard to get all of that into 40, 45 minutes. I mean, I see in the future, that maybe we do need some sort of a model to evaluate different countries, to see, if we have a questionnaire, how strong, on a scale of 1 to 10 is your central government? How broad is your tax base? What's the level of funding that you have for institutions, like the ones that you have in Greece or the ones we have in the States for providing service to people with disabilities? So being able to almost have like a score for how accessibility friendly a country or a particular metro area is, and then having like this sort of like universal set of criteria like the World Health Organization has, for instance, with their model disability survey. I know a couple times, I mean, you and I have had conversations, where it's almost like seeing what's happening in core cities in the United States and the level of infrastructure and support that you have there, that we don't necessarily see that in our own communities. I mean, I have that same sort of issue in South Florida. You've had that in Greece. And it's easy to feel this sort of envy for what is happening in these core metro areas or in core countries. I mean, I see you, for instance, as somebody who's a tremendous bridge person, between what's going on in the U.S., between what we are exchanging in this community to a country that's almost new to access, and and I see it here in South Florida. That if there's one thing I could wish for, it would be that we'd be able to share and almost have like an organizer toolkit, or almost have
that would be great.
Yeah, or a founder's toolkit, where we go in our respective communities, like, this is a checklist, this is what you need to happen. You need to start local meetup groups, you need to develop a body of advocates. You need to have like a behind the scenes, like task force with people in different aspects of corporate and government helping each other out. So, we're, I would hope that, this is something that we could share, for people in all countries, whether it's in East Asia or whether it's, in India. But I feel like all of us who are in emerging countries could definitely benefit from this. So on that note, let me thank everybody who's joined us and, who's stuck around for this full hour. And, Carrie or Patrick, if you guys want to open it up for questions, please do.
Oh, thank you very much, Claudio and Joanna. That was a very powerful talk. It would almost feel like we're cheapening the impact of it by just asking a very specific question. And I'm being mindful of the time as well. I'm afraid we won't have time for questions just now, but I just wanted to thank you for a very interesting and very unique talk. It touched on a lot of topics that are also dear to my heart at the moment. So thank you very much. That was great.
Yes, I was just going to say thank you too to our speakers. I think this was such a great presentation and a lot of points to unpack and think deeper on. So thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to pass out to the world what is happening in Greece, and thanking the community, which is the accessibility community, which is where I met Claudio. A very helpful and friendly community that I have friends and allies all over the world. I don't have them in Greece, but still I don't feel lonely because I have all of you around.
Excellent. That's good to hear. And that's what ID24 is also all about. It's about the global community celebrating the community.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry because I gave a lot of facts and information. If anyone would like any links to resources or data given, please find me on Twitter. My hashtag is ITALASLI. For more info, I will be glad to talk about anything related to accessibility.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Right. Well, sorry, Claudia, go on.
No. Thank you very much for having us here. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a real honor to be able to present on ID24.
Oh, thank you. Likewise, we're very honored. Right. And now for the audience at home, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 for future notifications. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia, our silver supporters, Adobe and Siteimprove, and our bronze supporters, Samsung Internet, DQ Systems, and the Basila Group, and is captioned by MyClearText. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour. I just need to look at my schedule, on the hour with Marcy Sutton and Samuel Prue, talking about engaging users to create accessible client-size routing techniques. In the meantime, once again, thank you very much, and I hope to see some of the audience members at the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you.